Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's session of Narrating Difference, a Comparative Literature Research Forum. Today we have Dr. Debaditya Bhattacharya with us. And before we begin, I would like to invite Harini to introduce our speaker to our audience. And then, sir, you can take over and start the talk. Harini?
Bhattacharya teaches literature at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. He has been working on historical sociology of Indian universities and the place of critical humanities in building alliances between institutions and their outsides. His most recent monograph is titled The Indian University, A Critical History. So we welcome you to our session, sir. Please continue with your talk. I'm sorry again.
No, nothing to be sorry about. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, and thank you to specifically the organizers. And not I think the word organizer is a bit of an understatement of the amount of effort and courage that it takes in these times to go out and organize in these ways, right? So thank you so much for doing this, and thank you so much for keeping alive the spirit of conversation, right? So the spirit of, as you call, narrating difference, because it is increasingly that which we need to kind of bring back to our university spaces. So thank you so much for doing this, and it's a complete a privilege and honor to be sharing thoughts with all of you. I will, of course, try and. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
sir.
okay,
You're
right,
yes.
yeah. Okay, so I will try and live by the time limit that I've been given, which I think is enough. But I have a tendency of kind of digressing into different things, and also kind of once I am in the process of talking, I generally lose a sense of time, which I guess is not exactly an academic thing to do. But just in case, right? So I overshoot my limit, so I would request Shachi to please just kind of send me a message, right? So, and that pop-up is all I need to then start wrapping up, right? So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's here, and thank you to Narrating Difference. Thank you to the Research Scholars Forum, right? So that you have put together for hosting these kinds of conversations. So what I have here today, or what I'll try and kind of lay out for you today, is just a kind of rather loose string of ideas, right? So, and more than simply ideas, it's also a set of working ideas that I have, and a set of ideas that I have um, partially kind of worked on in a book that is probably going to come out sometime next year, but the rest of it is also at the level of inchoate thought, right? So it's also at the level of a thought conversation that I'm having with different kinds of ideas and different traditions of thinking through the university, but also through the university, the very practice of humanistic studies, the practice of humanities studies, as it were. So that is what I'm going to largely kind of focus on. And I do hope to have a conversation with you after the rather kind of loose set of ideas that I'm going to leave for you to then deal with. So as I have named the talk, right? So it's more of an interrogation that I make, right? So, but I think it's important to kind of begin by placing in context the different registers that I bring up in the title of the talk, and the specific registers are universities, humanities, public or publicness, right? So, and contradiction, right? So these are the terms that I'll try and place against each other and then try and string together to arrive at some semblance of an argument. So I want to primarily, again, for clarity's sake, and for us to again be able to imagine a larger frame within which I pitched the conversation today. For me, the primary register out of the four that I have already kind of etched out, the primary register would be public. Right, and the question of publicness, right? How does one imagine publicness in and through the university, and how does one imagine publicness in and through the humanities? That is primarily the research question, as it were, right? But what I also then go out and posit by the end of my talk today will be how will be a form of arguing where I say that this kind of an imagining of publicness is also the doing of it, right? So that it is in imagining publicness, as I will go out and posit, right? So it is in this imagining of publicness that we can probably do publicness in the university and through the humanities. So what is this doing of publicness, right? And that's the moot question. So let me begin by framing a question that has been framed severally by different thinkers, right? So, and a lot of you would be familiar with it. Now, one of the questions that we have to really ask of any kind of attempt at educating citizens, right? And which is a formulation that comes from Plato to us, right? So because Plato goes out and says that what he was doing was educating the future guardians of the city of Athens. So any kind of attempt at trying to educate citizens, right? So primarily comes up against the question of in whose interest, right? So that is the primary question, something that in Latin, right, is phrased as qui bono, right? So in whose interest are we doing whatever we are doing? Is in whose interest are we educating citizens, right? So, and that is the question that I then think relates to the register that I want to work with, which is the register of publicness. I want to posit that if the university today and the humanities disciplines within the university today, right, so have to come together in the interest of somebody, in the interest of a spectral somebody, then it has to be by traversing the route of imagining publicness. It has to be for a public, right? And how does one do that public? How does one imagine that public? So I will, again, as I go along, I will try and make a philosophical pitch, and I hope that's okay, right? So because I think we are all here as thought interlocutors, so I think we can just try and work with certain strands of thought, right? Now, it is this question of publicness that I want to historically trace in relation to the humanities, in relation to the institutionalization of humanities studies in the university. And I want to ask, which is also the question that I frame in the title, I want to ask whether historically humanities studies or humanistic pursuit of inquiry has really been aligned with the public, and which is also then going to be a critique of the colonial university's imagination of humanities practice and humanities studies. And towards the end, I will then try and posit what could be a decolonial, right? Or in more specific terms, what could be an Ambedkarite formulation, right? So of doing public within the university, doing publicness within the university through the humanities. Now, historically, if one goes through the history of the institutional pursuit of the humanities, or in other words, what can be called the institutionalization of the humanities, one realizes that this story of the institutionalization of humanities studies is also the story of discipline formation. right? And the word discipline is, of course, coming as it does from the Latin root disciplina, right? So is a double-edged word, right? So discipline means or in its Latin root, disciplina means both the disciple as well as the regimentation, the disciplining of the disciple, right? So the very concept of a discipline is integrally, right, a technology of control, right? So a technology of creating a disciple in and through codes and regimes of discipline, right? And if one goes into the history of the humanities, one realizes of course, in its colonial variant, right, which is where we get the modern university from, right? So in the Humboldtian University, right? So the University of Berlin in 1810, of course, the Universitas, right? So the medieval Universitas is an institution, is an apparatus that existed much before the modern university came into existence. Of course, there are attempts in India, and particularly in current day India, to trace the root or, let's say, the birth of the university to, let's say, Nalanda, Takshila, Nalanda, right, so Vallabhi Vikramshila, which is a debate that I actually take up in some amount of archival detail in a project, and which I actually go out and debunk, and I through some amount of archival history by reading both I mean, by reading the Jatakas, as well as where you get the references to Takkashila, as well as by reading also the travel accounts, the travelers' accounts of Yuan Sang, I sing, right? So I actually go out and bust this mythification of Nalanda or Takshila or Vallabhi Vikramshila as university progenitors. But that's a debate that I'm not getting into at this point, because that's a debate that is mired in a lot of general kind of political currency. I mean, which is not to say that we are not going to take on political currency at all, right? So, but that's a debate that we can probably address as we go into the conversation session, as we go into the question and answers. But even in the colonial variant, right, so of the modern university as we have via Humboldt, via Schleiermacher, Fichte, right? So even if we go back to that history of the early 19th century Humboldtian university, one realizes that the humanities disciplines, right, so have had a certain kind of relationship with discipline, which does not necessarily lend itself to imaginings of publicness, right? So this argument that we often manufacture today, faced with what we call famously and what we are constantly moaning about and lamenting, faced with the crisis of the university, which also then can be interchangeably called the crisis of the humanities, which is something that one gets to hear all the time. Now, one of the arguments, one of the largely liberal arguments that comes up in conversations and through these kinds of group moaning sessions that we have, right, so is that probably what we need to do to tide over this crisis is to return the university, in a sense, to the liberal arts, right? So, of course, it's not as if that attempt has not been made, but that attempt has been made largely by private initiatives. That attempt has been made through these elite private liberal arts universities as we have around the country today, right? So, but I mean, a critique of that is very, very important, but it's not surprising. That's the point that I'm trying to make. It is not surprising that a return of the university to the liberal arts, which we think is also a form of redressing its disconnect from the public, right? So which is the argument that we often make, a liberal argument that we often fall prey to, right? So that to breach the disconnect between the university and the public, all we need to do is get the university back to a training of the liberal arts, right? So we have to basically try and realize that the future of democracy, the future of democratic citizenship is in a humanistic training. Now, it is not surprising that this kind of attempt at trying to bring the university back to a humanistic training must necessarily happen riding on private capital, right? So riding on private initiative, because the humanities, as I will try and unfold, right? So the story of the humanities as a discipline, or the story of the institutionalization of the humanities, right, so is not a story of aligning with publics. It is not a story of realizing publicness or imagining publicness. So my argument, as I kind of preempted already, is about busting this myth that has almost become a certain kind of liberal common sense, that probably the realization of publicness in democratic citizenship or in the practices of democratic citizenship, right, so lies in a rerouting of the university to its humanities disciplines, or in a kind of valorization of humanistic study. And, and of course, I will have a counterpoint by the end of this, right? So I do not want to give up on the hope that publicness is and that publicness is achievable through the public university. Now, therefore, the question of the history of the humanities disciplines, I would suggest, takes us to three different scenes, right? And these three different epistemological scenes, as I call them, three different epistemological situations, right, at different moments in time, right? The history of the humanities would actually tell us that these three scenes or these three epistemological situations are also three, or also in effect, three registers, right? So three very cardinal registers, which have now become synonymous with the imagining or the imaginability of a public, right? And these three registers would be: number one, the humanities as enabling a practice of liberty; number two, the humanities as enabling a practice of secularity; and number three, the humanities as enabling a practice of criticality, right? So liberty, secularity, and criticality are the three virtues that are peddled around the history of humanities studies. And it is these three registers that I want to take up one after the other, right, so through historical detours, and puncture the kind of easy association that we make between each of these registers and what I called the doing or the imagining of publicness. Right now, the first register, right, so that I spoke of, is the humanities studies, or the practice of the humanities as a story of liberty. Right now, and how aligned is this with the public? How aligned is this with the question of publicness? Now, this takes us back again in its Western variant. Of course, there are several attempts that have gone out and challenged this kind of Western teleology of let's say, the practice of knowledge as well, right? And for example, right, so people like Martin Bernal, right, so in Black Athena, would go out and offer a fantastic critique, right, so of this entire story of Greek civilization, right? But even as I said, right, so even as we talk of the modern university, right, so it is important that we take it back to, yes. Yeah. Is there a question or anything? Okay, no. So it is important that we take it back to what one might call the origin of the liberal arts, right? So in other words, in Latin terms, right, or as we know it, right, so the artes liberalis, right, so which is where the story of the liberal arts, right, so actually begins from. Now, of course, I mean, if you look at a document like the National Education Policy 2020, it's going to give you a completely different kind of meaning of the liberal arts, right, as the Chaucer Kala, which has historically no relevance, no justification, no precedence, right? So there is nothing, right? So that can really kind of establish this coincidence between the artes liberal, or the liberal arts as it is called, right? So this coincidence between the liberal arts and the Chaucer Kala, right? So this is of course a Vedic. I mean, as we all know, right? So this is a purely kind of Vedic slight, right? So that is given to systems of education today, and it is done with a specific kind of political motivation in mind. So So let us not be kind of led astray, right? So by imagining that, oh, the liberal arts actually happened elsewhere, right? So the liberal arts, of course, I mean, one can really do some serious decolonial work and find the roots and the traces of the practice of the liberal arts elsewhere. But there's nothing that sets up an easy congruity or an easy coincidence between, let's say, the Vedic Hindu imagination of a certain kind of knowledge practice, right? So, and and what we imagine as the liberal arts. So, in order to actually get to the first story, as I call it, right? So, the humanities or the practice of the humanities as the story of the practice of liberty, one really has to go back to the Athenian city-state. One really has to go back to the Greek civilization, right? And the Greco-Roman civilization, and look at the practice of the artes liberalis, right? So now, of course, I mean, this is probably known to a lot of you, but for the sake of the general kind of continuity of ideas, I will just reframe it for all of our ease and convenience, which is that what we today imagine as the division between the disciplines, right? So the division between the scientific disciplines and the humanistic disciplines, or let's say the natural sciences, the social sciences, right? So, or the human sciences, and what in other words can be called the performing arts, right? So these divisions did not exist within the originary imagination, fairly common knowledge, right? So that in the Greek enunciation, in the classical enunciation, right, of the artes liberalis, right? So there were 7 cognate disciplines, right? So all of which came under the rubric of the artes liberalis. These 7 disciplines were then, of course, divided into 2 sections, into 2 parts, or into 2 groups or classes. The first of which were called the trivium, the 3 foundational subjects of study, right? So without which nothing else can happen, right? And then we had the quadrivium, the 4, right? So what one can call the 4 secondary or derivative subjects of study, but they were practically, again, for all practical purposes, they were imagined in terms of, let's say, a moral economy of value, right? So they were imagined to be at par, right? So it is not as if the trivium and the quadrivium were separated in terms of what one can call a moral hierarchy of value, right? So they were, all these 7 disciplines were absolutely cardinal to the imagination of the practice of liberty in classical terms within the classical knowledge system, right? And the trivium, as again most of you will know, the trivium would be the 3 subjects of grammar, rhetoric, and logic or dialectics, right? So which is cardinal to any kind of knowledge production, right? Without grammar, without logic, and without rhetoric, there can be no knowledge, right? So this was the trivium. And then there was the quadrivium, the 4 derivative kind of, derivative not, again, as I'm saying, derivative not in a moralizing or a value inflected sense, right? So, but the 4 other disciplines would be, very interestingly, number 1, arithmetic, number 2, geometry, number 3, astronomy, and number 4, music. All right. Now, this was all that the artes liberalis as a classical knowledge formulation encompassed, right? So from grammar to music, right? And very interestingly, right, so the 4 disciplines which were considered to be part of the quadrivium were all, right, so philosophy were all, okay, I think, I mean, yes, Shruti, I think if you have any questions, you can definitely ask. Yeah, right. So the quadrivium, right? So the 4 subjects that we are talking about, right? So were all philosophical formulations, right? So where arithmetic would be the philosophy of time, right? So geometry would be the philosophy of space, right? And terrestrial space, right? So earthly space, as it were. Astronomy would be the philosophy of cosmic space, And then you have music, right? So which is again about a certain kind of philosophy of rhythm, right? So a philosophy that actually arranges time in order to produce a certain kind of phonemic effect, right? So these were the seven disciplines. Now, interestingly, and that is where, so if that is the originary, that is the foundational imagination of the liberal arts, right? So in the Greek or the classical knowledge system, right? So then what is very important for us to recognize that is the fact that the practice of these seven disciplines were imagined as absolutely crucial for the practice of freedom, right? And therefore, the liberal arts were called liberal not because they enabled freedom, but because they were allowed to be pursued by free male citizens alone. Right? And that is the basic presumption at the heart of the liberal arts, right? So which is that liberty is not everybody's prerogative, right? So that liberty, as enabled or as made possible by the liberal arts, was to be primarily the knowledge prerogative of the free citizen, right? For the slave, of course, there were the professional skills, right? So what later gets called savoir-faire, right? So that is a distinction that is very crucial to the very idea of the liberal arts, that the liberal arts, in postulating liberty, right? So in coming up with the virtue of liberty as the prerogative of the arts, right? So as the classical prerogative of knowledge practice, right? So was not something that was opened up to the public by any means or by any stretch of argument, right? So the liberal arts were insistently, right, so guarded against the incursions of the public, right? So the liberal arts, in so far as it enabled the practice of liberty, was largely a prerogative of, as I said, right, a certain kind of citizenship that devolved onto the male subject, and again the free male citizen subject, right? So not the foreigner, not the slave, not the woman, not children, right? So that is the first kind of instance that I wanted to begin with, that the liberal arts, even in its founding moment, right? So this was my first scene, as it were, right? So the liberal arts in its founding moment was not about enabling a certain kind of imagination of publicness, right? Is not about allowing knowledge, or is not about tooling knowledge in the cause or in the interest of publicness, right? So that was the first point. The second, right, so is when the humanities actually, or the humanities disciplines actually get formulated as a university pursuit, right? And the time when this happens is also very interesting, right? So it is only after the instantiation of the modern university, and after a series of events that happen, right, so through the 19th century, that the humanities disciplines actually become institutional subjects of study, right? Till then, the humanities were not imagined as university pursuits, right? And that is the next story, that is the story of what I call, right, so the humanities as making possible a practice of secularity, right? So which is something that happens through the 19th century. Now, in this wonderful book by John Roberts and James Turner, which is called The Sacred and the Secular University, right? So there is a framing of this argument that one gets, and very precisely and poignantly, right? So that that it is this divorce between the liberal and the public, between what we call the liberality of the liberal arts, right, and the public, that secularity tried to address, right? So that the question of secularity, that the secular humanities tried to address, but it failed, right? So why did it fail is the question that we come to, right? So now, with the coming up of the modern Humboldtian University in 1810, it was believed that the proper personality in the cause of what is called the Allgemeine Bildung, right, so in German, right, which basically means a common cultural education, right? So that is why the modern university comes into existence, right? So the modern university comes into existence in order to make possible a general education, right? So in order to make possible a certain kind of a common education of citizens. All right. Now, and of course, there is a fair amount of nuancing that one can make of that argument. But through this kind of an entire concept of the Allgemeine Bildung, right, so a common education, there is a certain kind of positing of commonness that makes us believe that probably the modern university worked with a certain awareness of publicness, but which is not true, as I will try and go on to prove. Now, this Allgemeine Bildung, or a common education, it was believed in the Humboldtian University, in and through the work of Humboldt, right? So it was believed that it was to be rooted in the sciences, and sciences not in the way in which we understand it today, which is a very, very gross kind of instrumentalization of science, but it was to be rooted or grounded in what is called in German Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft was the practice of science in and through philosophy, right? So a philosophical engagement with science, right? And what we see through the first half of the 19th century is that in the cause of Allgemeine Bildung, in the cause of a common education, the harnessing of science that happens in the modern university, right, is still largely reliant on what is called the method of naturalism. There is a term for it, which is all the university practices of Wissenschaft that one sees through the early 19th century, right? So one realizes that that science is largely engaged in, or science is practiced with a view to try and explain natural phenomena as driven by divine will, right? So it is almost an attempt that is made by science in the university, right? So the practice of Wissenschaft, right, so is all about trying to prove that natural phenomena are nothing but a revelation of God's will, right? Now, understandably, right, so this kind of an imagination of science, right, so through what is called methodological naturalism, right, so this kind of understanding of science as the revelation of providential design, right, so is finally kind of broken out of, is finally challenged, right, so by, as we know, right, so Darwin's experimental findings, and of course after that the post-Civil War American university, right, so which begins to restructure curricula, right, so along secular lines in what we call the antebellum colleges. Now, and that is the time, right, so that you have, therefore, as a move towards secularizing the sciences, right? So because science till then, as we said, in the practice of Wissenschaft, had still been rooted and grounded in the will of God, right? So as a method of secularizing the sciences, what comes about is the social sciences. What comes about is the Comtean and the Durkheimian right? So imagination of the social sciences. It is with the coming up of the social sciences in the university, right? So that there is a direct and a very, very visible move towards secularizing structures of knowledge. Now, understandably, right? So the social sciences become an antidote to the methodological naturalism of the scientific disciplines, right? So of Wissenschaft. But in the process, that generates a certain kind of threat, that generates a certain kind of a crisis of faith. And that crisis of faith then has to be addressed within the university. And what becomes the means of addressing that crisis of faith that is posed by the secularization of the sciences in the social sciences? What becomes the means of addressing this crisis? The humanities disciplines. It is then that the humanities disciplines are actually institutionally organized within the university, right? So in the latter half of the 19th century, right? So there is a clear move towards institutionalizing the humanities disciplines. And that is that is the time when, for the first time in the history of university knowledge production, we get departments in or departments of literary studies, what is called literature, right? So for the first time, we have the study of literature, we have the study of art history, we have the study of criticism becoming part of university pursuits, right? Till then, right, so these functions were assumed to be done by disciplines like natural theology and moral philosophy. Now, because the social sciences pose a threat to the dominance or the predominance of natural theology and moral philosophy, the humanities disciplines become an antidote. The humanities disciplines become a means of remoralizing the secular modern university, right? So it is through the setting up of departments in literature, art criticism, or criticism, art history and criticism, that it was believed that there is going to be a re-engagement with affect, with moral affect, right? So there was an attempt to try and re-sacralize the modern university because it had gone too far secular, right? And this move is very, very important. This move from, let's say, rhetoric, classics, and philology, which were earlier what was imagined as the practice of the liberal arts, right? So rhetoric, right? So the study of rhetoric, the study of classics, and the study of philology, all of which basically meant a very grammatical, exegetical encounter with texts, right? And from this grammatical, exegetical encounter with texts, now we move through the institutionalization of the humanities, we move to what was called the affective possibilities of reading literature, right? And it was the humanities disciplines were instituted with the primary agenda of negotiating with a regime of affects that was believed to be under threat by the secular social sciences. And what were these affects? These were affects like wonder, awe, amazement, terror, pathos, right? So the literature discipline or the literary disciplines and the critical disciplines that we imagine as humanistic practice, right, so were primarily attempts at trying to recreate a certain moral economy behind the secular university, right? So a certain moral economy behind the training imparted within the secular university. Now, what it ended up doing was that it created a certain kind of force of what I call affective subjectification. It created a very private regime of virtue, right? So it created a very, very private regime of morality, right? So something that gets imported again, right? So through the importation of the colonial university into the colonies as well, and through the importation of what we know is English language education, this kind of a creation of a private subjectivity, which is integrally a Catholic subjectivity, which is integrally a certain kind of moral subjectivity that is to be trained, right, in and through the study of literature, right, and what it creates is the currency of bhadrata, right, so in the colonial context, as we know, right, so it wants to create the figure of the Bhadralok as the mimic European man, right, so this entire private regime of virtue, right, so that it was the purpose of the humanities disciplines to engineer was was clearly a move towards privatizing the benefits of modern education, right? So through and very insistently, right, so through a certain kind of a moral regimentation of the personality of the scholar, right? So through a very, what one can call, right, so through a moral and a fairly important, I mean, one can call it a moral sanitization of the affects produced by reading, right? So how does one channel the affective impact of education, right? So, and the only way in which that is being done in the modern university is through this kind of a secular training into virtue, which is what one can call the postulation of a secular sacred, right? And that is the postulation of a secular sacred is integrally a very, very private form of virtue that the humanities practice, or the humanities disciplines was supposed to engender. Now, that's the I think I'll take just about 10 minutes more, right? So that's the second scene. The third scene, right, and which is what I call the postulation of the humanities as critique, and which is what we keep talking about all the time. And of course, I mean, there's reason enough to talk about it like that, right? But often there is a certain kind of uncritical championing of the critical humanities, right? So assuming that was integrally aligned with a certain kind of a public agenda, right? Or a certain kind of imagining of publicness. Actually, far from it, right? So the idea of a critical humanities discipline, right? So is something that again happens around the maturing of the modern university, right? And it happens in response to something that had already happened a century earlier, right? So where now in the modern university, we have disciplines like literature being taught in and through institutional pursuits, right? So, but literature itself, the meaning of literature itself, had undergone a very important cognitive shift, right? So in the 18th century, where literature in the 18th century and through the length and breadth of the 18th century, not just through what is called romanticism, which is often what is associated with this kind of a shift, right? But literature through the whole of the 18th century actually came to be redefined as imaginative writing, which it was not, right? So till then, literature was anything that was written, right? So literature came from the Latin root litera, which means anything that took recourse to the written letter, right? So was considered to be literature. But literature as imaginative writing is something that becomes the norm, is something that gets recognized, right? So as proper literature, as true literature, only as late as the 18th century. Right? And it is in responding to this kind of a changed meaning of literature that we see the modern university also trying to appropriate, right? So this rubric of literature as imaginative training into a certain kind of agenda of critique. Now, how does that happen, right? So how can imagination be, as we all know, how can imagination be a form of critique, right? And which is what happens, interestingly, right? So through what is called by Simon During as a sympathetic imagination, right? Now, it was believed that literature or the humanities as practiced within the university, right, so would enable an act of the sympathetic imagination. That is the literacy that it was supposed to actually equip students with, right? So a sympathetic imagination, right? Now, what is the epistemological status? What do we mean by a sympathetic imagination? Now, it was believed that through the humanities disciplines or through, let's say, literature, art history, criticism, right, so what was being attempted is the harnessing of the imagination as thinking up what is absent but what is possible, right? That is the work of what we are told, right? So literature, right? So to be able to think up the absent but possible, right? So literature trains us into thinking the absent as possible, right? So and this kind of a sympathetic imagination was therefore peddled as something which would constantly aspire for the absent but possible, but only insofar as it was done in a disinterested fashion. This was very, very important. And you know, right, so you are aware of how that becomes the function of criticism, that becomes the function of poetry, that becomes, of course, as you know, right, so all the way from the 19th to the 20th centuries, right, so we have from Arnold to Eliot, right, so people talking about that kind of a tradition, right, so of the disinterested pursuit of imagination, right, so where you are going to engage in otherness, right? So that is what the imagination helps you do. It helps you think up otherness as absent but possible only so far, only in as far as you can do it without necessarily risking your own being, without really becoming an interested participant. You must do it in a dispassionate form. So otherness as an object of interest, right, is what becomes the mandate of the critical humanities. And because that is believed to be the only means of doing critique. Critique as a disinterested exercise of engaging with otherness, right? So of imagining the absent but possible. Now, this very virtue, and which is the final kind of point about these three scenes, and then I'll end with a provocation. Right now, the final point is that this kind of a disinterested subjectivity is a deeply private subjectivity. Right, so the disinterested humanistic scholar is a deeply private intellectual. So the kind of humanities studies that we see happening through the exercise of the sympathetic imagination is something that engages with otherness without necessarily being touched by it, right? And that is the precondition, as I said, right, of institutionalized humanities as critique. So disinterested intellectuality becomes the only private form of scholarship, right? So that makes humanities practice possible within the modern university. So through all these three scenes, right? So the virtues that we imagine are the inalienable virtues, as it were, of the humanities, of the liberal arts, as we imagine them, right? So whether it be liberty, right, or it be secularity, or it be criticality, we realize that none of these virtues in the history of the humanities disciplines were imagined as forms of publicness, right? Or engagements with the public. They were rather these virtues were all attempts at trying to guard knowledge against the touch of publicness, And which is where I want to end with a final provocation, because I said the touch of publicness, right? So I want to bring Ambedkar here into the picture, right? And I want to end, right, with this question of touch, right? And the question that Ambedkar poses in the best way possible. Now, uh, and that is what I think, right? So the humanities disciplines really need today in order to reimagine themselves, right? So in a way, if the humanities disciplines have to become part of a program of what I called public humanities, and therefore part of a certain agenda for the public university, then the humanities disciplines need to work against their own history. The humanities disciplines have to, as it were, come undone. Right? So the humanities disciplines need to actually start from a premise of self-critique rather than the presumed, let's say, kind of criticality, right? So rather from the presumed, let's say, secularity of critique, right? So rather from the presumed of critique, right? So rather than beginning from this kind of a private imagination of possessing the necessary literacy, right? So of imagining the humanities as having given us the literacy to go out and critique the world, right? Which is often what the humanities are very easily, commonsensically, in a liberal definition, of course, right? So let's not get into the neoliberal or, let's say, the regressive, right? So the right-wing imagination at all. I mean, that's something that we can leave for discussions. But if one has to really reimagine the humanities as public humanities, then what the humanities disciplines have to do is work past their own history. And something that Ambedkar himself had given us a clue to. And Ambedkar, as you would know, right, so, has a series of critiques, right, of the education system as primarily a Brahminical system, right, of the intelligentsia as primarily a Brahminical class, right, and this critique of Ambedkar's, right, so the critique of the education system comes as early in Ambedkar's work as 1919, again, in a very lesser known statement, and which is arguably Ambedkar's second public, let's say, written form of document, right? So the second work that he really produces, right? So in writing on the question of untouchability and castes, right? So which was a report, a statement that he submitted to the Southborough Commission, right? So in 1919, the first. Of course, as we all know, right? So the first public document that Ambedkar produces on caste is called Caste in India, which was presented as at the anthropology seminar in India. So it is in the report to the Southborough Committee that Ambedkar for the first time actually launches into a critique, in a written critique, right, of the education system, right, of the intelligentsia as an inherently caste-marked intelligentsia, right. So, and Ambedkar, I want to end with this provocation that Ambedkar, right, so while he starts critiquing the education system in a Bombay Legislative Assembly debate, right, so which happened between the 25th and the 27th October 1939, which is just at the cusp of the Second World War, and there's a debate that is happening in the Bombay Legislative Assembly about whether, right, so the people of India had really been consulted, right, so through parliamentary processes, right, so whether the people of India were really taken into consideration, the opinion of the people of India were taken into consideration in enlisting India within the Second World War, right, so that is the debate that is happening in a debate where there are elaborate objections that are being raised to the colonial government's enlisting of India within in the Second World War, and the argument that is being constantly projected or presented is that the people of India have not been consulted, right? So that the will of the people of India, so that's also the formulation of a nascent constitutional democratic imagination, right? So that the will of the people of India has not been consulted. Now, at that moment, in 1939, much before, right, so the Constituent Assembly debates actually start, right? So in 1939, Ambedkar punctures this constitutional democratic formulation, or this constitutional democratic, or a nascent constitutional democratic imagination of the will of the people, by saying that, which people are you talking about? Right? So Ambedkar goes out and makes this impassioned speech, right, and says that, does this people of India, does this formulation, the people of India, right, so include the depressed classes, right? I do not believe in a formulation called the people of India. And he goes out and says that between the country and the depressed, of course, I mean, he first goes out and says that that between countries, right? So, of course, I will stand for my own country, but between the country and the depressed classes, right? So I will stand for the depressed classes. The country does not in itself represent the people's will, right? So, and then those were the times when, at least in Legislative Assembly, there were debates that happened, right? So now we have we know what happens, right? So now we have all forms of clampdown, right? But in those times, right? So there is BG Kher, right? So who raises a point of order, and he says that I take offense, right? So in today's times, of course, there would have been charges slapped against Ambedkar, right? So, but BG Kher takes offense at it, and BG Kher goes out and raises a point of order and says that I take offense, right? So Ambedkar cannot say that between the country and the depressed classes he will stand for the depressed classes, or that the depressed classes will have precedence, because the depressed classes are finally a part of the whole, right? Ambedkar makes a fantastic retort, and which I think is the clue to redoing the humanities. Ambedkar says, I am not a part of the whole. I am a part apart. I'm a part apart. Right? Now, I think that exactly is the work that the humanities disciplines have to train us into doing. The humanities disciplines are not about, and we have seen, right? So the humanities disciplines, in presuming liberty, secularity, and criticality, assume that they are working in the cause of the public, right? So from an enlightened imagination, from an enlightened presumption of public good. But if the humanities disciplines really have to throw themselves open to publicness, then what they must train us into is an imagination of the part apart, right? So they have to train us into the part that is not part of the whole, right? They have to train us into, as it were, in Ambedkar's terms, the imagination of an anti-people, right? That is the work of a real democratic retooling of the humanities. We have to learn to, as we say, right? So we have to learn to engage with the anti-people, right? So the part apart, right? So, and that I will, this is what I'll end with, right? So how one does that is something that we can have conversations about, right? So, but it is it is precisely by questioning the presumed publicness of the people, right? So the presumed easy sliding in of certain virtues of the private conscience, right? So liberty, secularity, criticality, as transposable into the public will, right? So as easily coincident with the public will, right? So it is by questioning these easy equivalences that we have to learn to think the anti-people into being. And it is only from the point of view of the anti-people that a humanities practice can really become a public exercise, right? So I do go further into how this can be done. I do posit a certain imagination of the just institution, and how does the humanities then, or the humanities disciplines then, enable a thinking of justice, right? And justice is not something that can be imagined in and through recourse to or reference to the will of the people. Justice has to be thought through in and through recourse to the will of the minority, the non-people. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, for this really, really interesting talk. I think all of us here will leave with some food for thought after this. We would have loved to hear you speak more on this, but because we have constraints of time, let's open the floor for questions and we can continue the discussion there. Um, if anyone has questions, you can please raise your hand or maybe type in the chat box.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too difficult or too philosophical. I don't know. I mean, I thought that because we have something like a research forum here, right? So one might as well deal with some difficult ideas, right? So
Yes, I think we were able to follow through.
I'm so sorry if
And
I,
understand.
yeah, because the
No,
online
not.
mode also does, yeah.
So are we going to say something or are we not going to say something?
That is the question.
Yeah, that is the question. That is indeed the question.
Okay, I can actually take up that question. Whether this, yeah, but yeah, Sanjay, I think, yeah,
this is Sanjay here. Yeah.
yeah.
So that was a very interesting talk and very, in fact, thought-provoking, because normally when we imagine about humanities and I think of 16th century writers like Erasmus or Montaigne, then Montaigne also he focused a lot on humanities, and he, out of so many hundreds of essays, he wrote at least 5 of them especially on education. And he says the objective of education is the capacity to judge.
Right.
The capacity to judge. So that was the objective of the education, and particularly of humanities. And Rabelais, at the same time, in 16th century, in one of the letters, in fact, which is a part of his work, that Pantagruel is suggested by Gargantua, what kind of education you should attain. So humanities is again focus of that. Erasmus does the same thing. So in 16th century, all these thinkers, Erasmus, Montaigne in his essays, and then Rabelais in his novels, all of them focus on the study of humanities.
Yeah.
And by the time of Enlightenment, when we come to Kant, he asks this famous question: "What is enlightenment?"
Yeah.
And in that essay, his basic argument is that basically that enlightenment is attaining the majority. Means you should feel yourself mature, that nobody should guide you, that the implication is that the church should not tell you what is right and wrong, what is virtue, what is vice, but you should be able to judge for yourself. That again comes the capacity to judge, or maybe what you call criticality. So my question is that is there something intrinsic in the nature of humanities which has landed us up, as you were saying, in 19th century, that humanities was supposed to be a kind of alternative to religion as for moral teaching, which has been also highlighted by Terry Galton in his book, Literary Theory and Introduction. So was it something intrinsic in the nature of humanities, or it is because the people who are controlling the dissemination of knowledge, as you were saying, institutionalized humanities? So what kind of other humanities we can imagine other than institutionalized humanities? So is there any hope to redeem, to take those objectives of liberty, security, secularity, and criticality back and put it on the agenda of education and particularly humanities?
Wow, yeah, I think that's a terrific, that's like a, that's that's a massive question. And so probably we could take a few questions, and then, I mean, that'll give me a little bit of time to think up my answers as well. So I'm just plainly speaking out of the logic of convenience here. So probably if we have another question, and then I could just, I'm also trying to think my answer through. And of course, I mean, I do have certain pointers with regard to Sanjay's question. Thank you, Sanjay. I think that's terrific. Yeah. Any other question if we have? Yeah, I think Vedant has raised his hand.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the session, sir. It was really helpful. And I think I agree with you on several aspects, but I have a question with regards to, so in a lot of such uh, debates and discussions around the university, particularly contemporary discussions around the university, ones that I have been engaging with at least, I find that there is a tendency to somehow put the responsibility or the onus of redeeming the university on the student population due to several factors. Uh, I want to know what would your opinion be in this regard, because like in a state of affairs where uh, we see that the entire student composition, the diversity has been compromised, the faculty appointments have been compromised. How do we form solidarities? How do we reach in a state of agreement with everything around us falling apart? I'm sorry if this is not an academic question, but this is emerging from a concern, a very real concern as a student. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Again, a terrific question. Okay. So should we wait for one more question if there is any? Oh, Upal. Yes, Upal.
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation. Seems like this is also new direction in which your work is going, history of the humanities. So I was thinking about, obviously this is more of a conceptual history. So it's not maybe correct to measure it in terms of like certain empirical pointers, but I would once again just conceptually try to think of the colonial university and see that the colonial university is emerging in protest against the uh, imperialized university. So let's say the University of Calcutta is building itself up as a nationalist institution. And in the self-imagination of that institution, the humanities are disciplines are always connected to public service. And this is true even of the earlier version of the imperial institution, where reading literature would actually be a means to go and become a part of colonial officialdom. And because certain differentiations were not yet made, people doing science, literature together would all participate in colonial officialdom. And this is the state that is being built, where it is clearly excluding the citizens of India. And then over time, India is waking up with its nationalist claim on the university, and it's pushing the university to become inclusive of a wider public. So So now the nationalist university is spreading its wings, and it's trying to extend its scope to a wider public. So much so that even in the early 20th century, you see the colonial state itself is talking about university education for depressed classes. The Sadler Commission, for example, it has entire chapters on university education for depressed classes, and there are already colonial governmental measurements where the state is trying to understand how deep the public how deep the their investment in the public has gone, and this is obviously against nationalist claims on that public. So what I'm therefore trying to think of is that all of what towards the end, when you invoke Ambedkar, or even the 19th century moment of the privatization of virtues, from that period till the more till the early 20th century, when sort of early forms of decolonization can be seen, like I'm simply talking about the deepening of the nationalist movement, not so much theoretically decolonization. But throughout, the university here seems to have an official commitment to a public, and it has started imagining different categories of that public. It has started categorizing the public, be it in terms of women, be it in terms of, obviously, in the context of late nationalism, let's say Muslims would be a separate category, as well as backward classes. So within the official imagination of the colonial university, which has built itself on a nationalist movement, we see the university committed to a kind of public which you are talking about. Now, one can always say that this commitment is tokenism, this commitment has not been lived up to its promises, it has failed, it has been elided, it has been robbed of its potential. But I'm not trying to think of a theory practice gap. I'm trying to think of the imagination itself to begin with. There I see an inclusion of the kind of public you're talking about when I look at the colonial university. So where, therefore, how do I relate this condition to your presentation? I'm not talking of the Anglo-American university as well, for which a case can also be made of public commitments. But let's say if I stick to India, because you ended with Ambedkar, and obviously there is a route here of decolonizing proposal. So that's why I was thinking that if we trace that history, this is what I see. So how would you respond to that?
Okay, thank you. Acha, Candle has, yeah, so we will take, yeah, so we will take the questions. Yeah. Thank you, Kendall. I think that's a really, really beautiful suggestion. Yeah. Okay. So should I address the questions, or should we? I mean, so probably I could just address the questions. I think, I mean, I've got a wealth of questions, and questions that I don't necessarily have answers to already, right? But I will still attempt some answers, because it doesn't make sense to just say, oh well, right, I will think through these questions and come up with answers in due course. So I first of all, Sanjay's question about, let's say, the practice of criticism, right, and how the practice of criticism as integral to the humanities, right, or to the humanistic practice of knowledge, right, so is something that even outside of institutionalizations, or even outside of the story of institutionalization, has already been mooted as far back as in the 16th century, right? And of course, Sanjay, you mentioned Erasmus, Montaigne, Rabelais, right? And and you took it back to, I mean, so from Erasmus to Kant, as it were, right? And and then you said that, and your question was whether there's something intrinsic to the humanities disciplines, right? So that has really landed us in this loop, right? Or is it, as you said, right, because of the institutional structures, right? So it is because of, let's say, the trappings of power, right? So that institutions finally force the humanities to the service of, right, so that we've landed where we have landed, right, so that these virtues, these otherwise uh, vaunted virtues of the Enlightenment, have come to become the carcasses of something quite opposite, right? Now, I do believe, right, and this is my position, and this is what I'm trying to argue here. I do believe that there is a certain intrinsic aporia, right? So within the very conceptualization of the humanities, right? And not just the conceptualization of the humanities in a non-institutional sense, but also something that then gets taken forward into the institutionalization, which is what I spoke of largely. Now, and what is this intrinsic thing that fates humanities practice, or that fates the humanities disciplines to a certain kind of hollowing out of what otherwise gets passed off as its emancipatory potential? I think the intrinsic fault line of the humanities is precisely what you, taking off from Montaigne, called the capacity to judge, right? And it is this capacity to judge is something that often it gets conflated with, and which finally receives a full formulation in Kant and Kant's deontological ethics, Kant's, let's say, imagination of the categorical imperative, right? So where the capacity to judge itself stands in, right, so for a certain Enlightenment imagination of justice. Now, the truth is that the capacity to judge is not the same as justice, and the conflation of, right, so the imagining of justice with the capacity to judge is a very deeply moralizing move, right, and a deeply what I call, right, so a very deeply problematic move towards disinterestedness, which I think is the bane of humanities studies. I think what is absolutely intrinsic to the way in which humanities disciplines have been imagined through, and I gave you in the colonial version, right? So from, let's say, classical systems of knowledge formation to the Humboldtian University and after, right? So what really has become the bane of this entire history is this claim to disinterestedness, which is absolutely the crucial, or which is the precondition for the capacity to judge, right? And which is what we see, right? So in that moment of Montaigne's, and in the use that Montaigne is making of the form of the essay, right? So in of course the Kantian dialectic, right? So, and it is this disinterestedness that I think is an innately private virtue, right? So it is an it is an innate presumption of intellectuality as a private disposition, right? And that is the problem, right? So to where the humanities scholar or the humanistic scholar, it's not, I mean, it's not a real kind of revelation that I'm making here. The humanistic scholar is deeply private, right? So it is a retreat into the virtue of private intellectuality. Now, what I try and therefore take issue with is this moralizing penchant, right? This capacity to judge, I think, as I said, I consider it as a moralizing move and not an ethical move, right? Which is a critique that comes from, let's say, decolonial scholars, which is a critique that comes from feminist scholars, which is a critique that actually comes from even abolitionist scholars, right? So around the idea of the university, around the fact of the university, as it were, right? So even university abolitionists, right, so would take on the ethical kind of counterpoint. So I think it's important to kind of sever, right? So it is important to kind of separate the moral from the ethical and realize that what the humanities constantly, as a disciplinary formation, what the humanities was trying to do was substitute the moral for the ethical. And the answer, and which is the second part of the question that Sanjay had, which is then how does one really recuperate, right, to the humanities, right? I do believe that if we are implicated in that history of colonial institutionalization, and we obviously are by virtue of history, right? So no matter how much of decolonial work has happened, right? So no matter how much of decolonial critique of the colonial university exists, we are of course implicated in that long history, and we not only are we implicated, we have reproduced that history of colonialism in and through the university as well, which is something that Ambedkar is responding to, right? So which is something that of course we have enough of Dalit critiques of right now, which is not to say that therefore one has to give up on the humanities or one has to give up on the practice of the humanities in the university. And which is what I touched upon. I did not have the time to really kind of flesh it out into a program, but that is precisely my agenda, that there has to be a re-engineering of the program of the humanities as a program of self-critique. Right, so the humanities disciplines have to probably launch themselves or relaunch themselves, right? So in the university from a premise not of enlightened critique, but from a premise of self-critique, and which is what is not possible without the one thing that the humanities actually equips every reader with. And that is what I call, and of course I don't call it, right? So, but of course, which I use a specific term for, which is the counterfactual imagination, right? So what the humanities or the practice of the humanities actually trains us into, right? So the thinking up of the absent as possible is nothing but a training in the counterfactual, a certain kind of use of the counterfactual as method, right? So the question, what if things were the other way, right? And this is the question that I believe the humanities disciplines really have to ask, right? So what if, right, so this was otherwise, right? And that is a question that will then face the humanities to its own, I think, histories of complicity. And that is really the question, the counterfactual question. What if the social was, or what if the social were to be understood outside of its historical situation? That is the work of historical justice. The work of historical justice is to be able to imagine the social outside of its historical situation. And the humanities disciplines are the only ones who can train us into it. But as long as the humanities disciplines do that in the name of enlightened critique, I think we have missed the bus, right? So we probably have to face up to the complicities of the humanities disciplines in and through the premise of self-critique. And for that, of course, the what if question is absolutely important. Vedant's question, again, I think it is the most important question facing our universities today. But I also want to kind of reiterate the fact, and which is not to put, it might seem like that, right? So, but I'm not trying to put the onus back on the student population. But I do believe that the route to what I call a re-engineering of the humanities as self-critique is something that can only happen. I'm sorry to say only, but I do believe, and which is why the student subject is such a threat, right? So can only happen through the student, because it is, if there is one presence, if there is one subject within the space of the university, within the entire landscape of the university, which is not disinterested, that is the student, right? So it is the student alone whose interestedness is the root and the source of fear and danger, right? So because the student subject cannot but work as interested participants, right? And every figure of the professional, right? So the moment you enter the life of professions, right? So the professionalization of subjectivities, right? So is what takes you into what I've called the history of disinterestedness. So I do want to still repose hope and faith, in which and not onus. I don't think it is therefore, right, so for the students to kind of then take it upon themselves, but it is something that makes the student such a source of fear and threat, and which is exactly what is happening. This kind of a retooling of student composition, right, is something that is happening through something like the CUET, right? So where they're through this kind of what is apparently called the commoning of the university exam, right? So what you try and neutralize is precisely that force of interestedness that the student subject alone can come with into the university, not the professional scholar. So yes, so the state has unleashed an entire, of course, compromised recruitments and the recruitments of political, the installation of political cadres, the installation of practically Hindutva mobs, right, so into the university, right, is the state's response to the force of the student subject, to the force of what I call interestedness in the student subject. I'm sorry for making it sound like an onus, right? So, but it is not as an onus that I'm saying this. I'm saying that this is the only space of hope for the humanities to retool itself as self-critique. Upal, again, I think brilliant is an understatement. It's a terrific question, and I am not sure if I have a precise answer to it, but I will try and attempt an answer. Absolutely, I am completely in agreement that all the way from the post-colonial university to, all the way from the colonial university to, let's say, an anti-colonial mobilization of the university, there is a concept of public service, right? So there is a certain kind of harnessing of the university to a concept of public in policy, right? So in at least colonial policy, right? So, or even in movement language, right? So even in, let's say, anti-colonial languages of struggle, right? So there is definitely, I hope I'm audible. Yeah. So there is definitely, right, so a certain kind of a connection, a constant rhetorical connection to public service that is being made, right? So, and how does one then and there is, as you said, right, so we are told, right, so through this entire history in the Indian case, right, so of the colonial university molting into the anti-colonial movements, or providing fodder for the anti-colonial movements, right? So there is a certain imagination of the university as having a certain obligation to the public. Now, my answer to this is that this constant referencing of the public is the result of two things. Number one, that for the first time, with the coming up of the colonial university, right? And of course, I mean, through the 1813 amendment to the company charter and all of that, right? So we know all this history, right? So it is with that, and then how it leads to the setting up of the colonial university. There is an apportioning of public funding, right? So the question of the public, the way it appears, right, in colonial documentation is largely related to a very, very instrumental question. And that instrumental question, I think, is the question of finances, right? And therefore, there is a certain kind of flirtation with publicness that one sees as part of the entire colonial archive. Now, how it enters into an anti-colonial vocabulary is interesting, and I think that is precisely, right, so what then bombs in our faces, right? So it is this entire anti-colonial mobilization of the public, right, so that then bombs in our faces today, right? So in the let's say the Hindutva imagination of the public university as necessarily becoming a propaganda machine, right, so as necessarily becoming an organ of the state. And it is not surprising. We didn't have to wait for Hindutva. We didn't have to wait for the RSS to try and retool the university, right? So we had it in the Nazi example as well, right? So the way in which the anti-colonial manifesto, right, particularly in and around the time of Swadeshi, right, so the Swadeshi and boycott movements, right, to the partition of Bengal and thereafter, right, so the way in which the question of the public is then taken up in anti-colonial, let's say, archives of struggle, is again by questioning the publicness of spending, right? So I think the anti-colonial use of the register public does not depart from the colonial ruse, does not depart from the colonial slight, which is to conflate public with funding alone, right? And nothing more, nothing beyond, right? And that is where the anti-colonial imagination also, I think, eventually breeds the horrors of what we see in the post-colonial university, right? So because it never quite manages to relatively separate the question of financing from the question of publicness, right? And the question of publicness is definitely more than the question of financing, which is what I started with, right? So interests, right? So what is it? Whose interests are we talking about, right? So, and as I said, right, so that the post-colonial university must necessarily breed the horrors of, let's say, the Hindu right-wing reincarnation of it is not surprising. We'd seen this happen in the Nazi example. We had seen this happen exactly in the terms that you laid out, right? So where university service, where knowledge service, right? So when knowledge is imagined as service to the state, right? So this entire kind of training, university training is leading to a certain kind of practice of public service, right? So, and this is the bane. This is what in German is called Wissensdienst, right? So which is knowledge as service, right? So which is where finally, and it breeds the horrors of fascism. It breeds the horror where knowledge becomes service to the state, right? So through miscognized, right? So through a deliberately slighted use of the register public, right? So it is not surprising that the public will finally bomb in the face of publicness, right? So I'm absolutely happy to kind of have more of conversations with you on this, because I do have a thing or two to say about the other ways in which the question of publicness enters the colonial and anti-colonial archive. Kendall, I think again you've just kind of hit the nail, as it were, right? So and how the university therefore almost becomes a corollary to the museum, right? And that is exactly right. So that is exactly what I was also trying to get at, and which is precisely what the museums are also doing. Right, so this kind of a disinterested exhibition of otherness, right? A matter, I mean, isn't the politics of museumization precisely a politics of the sympathetic imagination? So I'm absolutely thrilled that you bring this, and it's a very, very unlikely kind of comparison that you make. It's a very unlikely analogy that you draw up for us, right? So between the university and the museum, I hadn't thought of this analogy, so thank you so much. And it actually is the most accurate analogy, right? So this kind of disinterested pursuit of otherness, right? So, or exhibition of otherness. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think
One more.
Pal has a question. Yes. Ipshitadi, yeah.
Nana Songjukta
Okay.
has her hand up.
It's first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I don't have any question. I have an observation that I want to share with you. Since it is all perception and the way we judge and further, the capacity of judgment is that you already pointed out came into my mind is we also relate the same thing with Kant critique of judgment.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
this and so to keep oneself among from the process of keep oneself away from the process of making somebody the other can only be happen only when we stop this type of categorizing and in order to be objective in one's perception of a subjective entity, that is the self, can be a way of engage with difference. That is what I feel that we can also think in the way.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm completely in agreement, right? So, and you've actually kind of nuanced my argument for me. Thank you so much. And I mean, by bringing in the question of perception as being at the heart of judgment, right? And yes, I mean, Kant's critique of judgment is what takes the register of aesthetic judgment, right? So which is what takes the question of reason into aesthetics, right? So the question of reason finally comes up, the question of truth finally comes up against the question of beauty, as it were, right? So, and yes, absolutely, I completely agree, completely. Thank you.
Yes, sir. If I love, suppose for an example, if I love rose, as I love rose, I can say that I love this rose. So it must be a sense of disinterestedness will be there, and from that point of view, we can say whatever I want. So that is the thing. I mean, it must be take apart from one's oneness. That is what I am trying to say.
Totally, completely in agreement. Yeah. Yes, I think. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk, sir. I think that with the humanities being under threat from certain quarters and the crisis of the humanities, there is an impulse to protect and defend it, and that can sometimes lead us to complacency or taking things for granted. And what you said, asking for us to turn a critical gaze on the humanities themselves, I think that's very salutary. My question is about specifically the role of literature vis-a-vis the rethinking of the humanities that you are proposing. So you've talked about the role of the affect, and how that has changed in the way the university has evolved. The idea of the humanities has evolved over the centuries. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about how affect, but also specifically the work that literature departments, English departments have to do in this rethinking that you are talking about.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Vignesh. Yeah. So probably I can take some more questions, and then I will, of course, take up the question of literature. So very crucial. I think Ipshitadi was. Yeah, Satish, yes.
Hi. So I'm actually very intrigued by this idea of indifference that you bring in, particularly in terms of thinking about the university as a space and curriculum and so on and so forth. And if we're going back to moments like the Enlightenment or German Romanticism and German idealism in particular. And I'm thinking also of the university as a space closer to home, right? In terms of located outside or otherwise than where it was perhaps intended to be located, and by which I mean Europe or the United States. And you bring the example also up of Nazi Germany. And I'm wondering whether we are now in a moment in history where the university is finally realizing its potential as a hostile space. In the sense that if it is indifference, then it is indifference because it is an imagination of the other. And so this indifference to difference or otherness has been a principal fault line in the imaginary of the humanities. I was wondering, and so also in the context of decolonial or anti-colonial work in particular, as several people have postulated these critiques. I'm thinking also of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak and her work in critique of post-colonial reason. And I'm wondering whether that is a principal fault line that you see in a conception of the humanities.
Right. Oh, wow. Terrific. Thank you. Yes, this is like more fodder for thought, but absolutely. Yeah, I'll definitely take this on as well. Yes. Anybody else? Yes, Ipshitadi.
I think we should have you again, because the other part that you were talking about, which you did not say, regarding the other models, right? I mean, eventually we ended up talking about a derivation of a particular way of thinking, which is actually a way of relating to the world in a stratified society, which is accepted as natural. So if we start from, Greece, and we'll end up in at least the English colony, if not in the French colony, which we did, which is fine. So just to say that, I was thinking in terms of, let's say, Rabindranath, in relation to what Satish just said, that a space outside somewhere, which is again very interesting. And thank you very much for, the depth and passion of your argument, that it's made the starkness of this whole thing, where you end up in indifference, which is a very sobering thought in relation to the questions that came up also of the role of the student. And I really liked the very obvious way in which you answered it, that, the student is the only interested party in the university, which actually is, I'm wondering whether anybody thought of that as the basis of institutionalizing. And it veers completely away from, any thought of an equal other. And that in itself is blasphemy. It veers away from the moment you say discipline. As you said, it's related to disciple. Now, in our culture, whatever that may mean, there have been critiques in various languages of precisely discipledom. And sometimes we think that it is coming from, where is it coming from? Maybe from rationalism, which we have just discussed. Maybe it is coming from, rationalism in Islam, which we never discuss. So, the other possibilities which are there, which existed side by side with what came to us through colonial means. And those possibilities are things that are, systems that we can reach to. And I'm saying this from a very practical point of view, because I agree completely with you that the philosophy behind the university and the philosophy behind conceptualization of humanities had better change pronto. And it is not going to be counter to this. It is going to be a completely different way of imagining even the idea of knowledge and the fact of, this whole giving in charity. At the moment, what people in Delhi are talking about around the seats of power is that knowledge in India was always democratic. So you have that very strong threat coming into the whole idea of a public which is not differentiated. And therefore there completely have to be plural models or relational models of pedagogy itself. The teacher, how we think, whether teacher and whether the position of the teacher. And coincidentally, just today, that is the thing that we were saying in a post-colonial literature class, that we have been using this paradigm of thinking in academia and this form of categorization for 2 centuries too long. So now we need to have you to speak to us next about what you conceptualize as actually, taking off from Ambedkar.
Right.
Which is
Okay.
the physical space that we are talking about. The physical space, who sits where and who says what to whom, who can get inside there.
Right.
Right. Regardless of what the history is. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
You just have to come back again and tell us the next part.
Yeah, sure. Anytime. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'll just briefly, we've kind of overshot our time, and people must be raring to go for dinner, right? So I'm sorry for keeping you back. But yeah, but I'll just quickly take the last kind of chain of questions, and brilliantly kind of educative questions that have come for me. So first is Vignesh's point about how, again, the way you put it was just so accurate, right? So that the impulse to defend the humanities presumes a certain kind of innocence of the humanities, which is historically not the case, right? So the humanities disciplines have been part of a history of complicity, right? So, and we might as well just address that complicity rather than presume that, oh well, right? So the humanities are the unconditional and the unqualified antidote, right? So but more crucially, the role of literature. I think the role of literature precisely lies in, again, what I called the counterfactual, right? And it's not me who's making this point, but of course, the very idea of a practice of literature. When I say the idea of a practice of literature, it might sound a little ironic, but what I mean is that the idea of translating literature into practice, the idea of doing literature, as it were, right? So let's say the materialization of literature is precisely by asking this question of what if, right? So this was not the case, right? So what if, right? So the social, and that is exactly what literature does, right? So I think you've kind of given me the cue to return to the formulation that I made, which is that what if, right? So society was to be imagined outside of history. Right. And when I say that what if society were to be imagined outside of history, I don't mean society being imagined ahistorically. Right. So what if the terms of historical visibility, what if the terms of historical cognition and recognition, right, were to be changed? Right. And that is exactly what literature helps us do. Right. So to be able to imagine the social outside of the historical, and outside of, therefore, the immanent, right, and the immediate, right? So to imagine society, or the social, as it were, outside of the immanent and the immediate, is the task of literature. And therefore, literature is one of the primary candidates, I think, for a training in the counterfactual. I completely kind of stake my entire life and being on that point. Right, so and it's absolutely crucial. Satish, again, I mean, you've just given me a wonderfully new, I don't know whether new is the word, but wonderfully accurate way of looking at exactly what I presented. And you call it indifference, right? So, which is not a term that I used, and I think, it is a term that is very helpful for me. And I think your question also ties to what Ipshita then brought up. So and you also brought in the question of the university's location, and I think the way you formulated it, whether what we see now is the university realizing its own hostility, indifference, right? So it's in this kind of a rearing of indifference, right? So now I want to, and this is something that I do build on, right? So and of course, there is some bit of this work done by scholars on Ambedkar, right? So I can think of Aishwari Kumar, right? So who's also worked on this, right? So in the classic the text that he's written. So so where one of the ways in which, therefore, the counterfactual can be posited or posed is through what not just Aishwari Kumar uses it in and through the reference of Ambedkar, is by imagining an ethics of non-indifference, right? So just a politics of difference is not enough. This is an argument that I do make, right? So in this work and the things that I've done with this work or parts of this work, right? So and which is what we have assumed, right? So that the counter or the antidote to what you call the culture of indifference bred by institutionalized humanities, right? So we assume lies in a politics of difference, right? But via Ambedkar, we get to know, and which is why I also ended with that part-apart example, right? So anecdote, right? So that entire question of the anti-people, right? So what the humanities have to be probably now reconfigured as is or should be harnessed to an ethics of non-indifference, right? So not just a politics of difference, and that is probably the real task. But thank you. Ipshita, again, of course, I do have a lot to say about the Tagorean University, and of course, there's actually some bit of work that I've recently kind of been doing on the Tagorean University vis-a-vis the basically a Tagore Ambedkar, imagining a dialogue between Tagore and Ambedkar vis-a-vis the question of education and the question of the university. And I've actually kind of framed this entire debate in the context of Weber, right? So, and in the context of Weber's Science as a Vocation, right? So, and how is it that Tagore, with his instance of the cooperativist university, and Ambedkar, with what I then also using Weber through Wendy Brown and all of that, right? So Ambedkar, right? So by almost staging a nihilistic penchant within the Brahminical university, right? So how there is an alternative decolonial template, right? Or if you like, an alternative decolonial manifesto for the Indian university there, right? And it is of course, for Tagore, right? So to have the university speak to the ashram Tapovan school, right? So that kind of bridging of completely kind of separated orders of cognitive skilling is so very important, to also stage that, right, so in a provincial setting, right, so as opposed to the instance of the elite colonial liberal university, which is by necessity metropolitan, which is by necessity urban, right? So, and Tagore is, of course, and of course also alongside that, as you hinted, right, so the setting up of the Institute of Rural Reconstruction, right, so as a practice of dealing with slave labor, right, so alongside the practice of the liberal professions. So I think, I mean, that is an accurate kind of possible manifesto for an alternative Indian university. So I actually, I mean, interestingly, I've tried thinking through this question, and probably that could be the next kind of conversation that we could have.
Yeah. So, if someone thinks something, yeah.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. But we do have a small announcement. Anupama has shared a link in the chat box for where we share future research forum session announcements, or if someone of you would like to present your work, you can also share that with us. Other than that, yes, I would like to invite Gauri now for a formal vote of thanks for today's session. Gauri?
Hello, you can see me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the lovely talk. Formally, I would like to thank our speaker today, Dr. Debaditya Bhattacharya, who took out the time out of his busy schedule to give this amazing talk today. It was a really lovely presentation and has opened up a lot of new perspective, a lot of new windows of thought for everyone. And thank you to those of you who've attended this talk. Thank you to Ipshita ma'am too. It was nice seeing you again. And also thanks to the forum for setting up this talk, and hope to see you guys at the future events conducted by this forum. Thank you.
I think I should thank all of you, right, so for doing this. And probably the first step towards retooling the humanities is by setting up these forums. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shakti. Everyone else.
Ishara, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Simi was here. Oh, we forgot to say thank you to Simi. But thank you, everybody. Obviously, was here as well, I think.
Oh, wow. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this. And I do hope to meet all of you guys in person sometime soon. So whenever I'm in Hyderabad, I will make it a point to kind of regroup.
Yes, we would love to have you over as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.